So I'm Palma Strand, and I am really excited to be here. When Kayla reached out to me in January, February, I thought, wow, okay, that sounds great. I have lived in Arlington since 1986, which is longer than many of you have been around here. And I'm excited to do this. So today I want to just talk a little bit about kind of what this is about. So I'm a lawyer by training, and I've been involved in Arlington politics, community work for a really long time. And you know, I came at it very much with a lawyer's sort of head orientation. And as I got into sort of looking at how things work in the community, I realized that it was really all about relationships. It's like all about relationships. And you know, as somebody who was very head oriented, that was like, oh, okay, that's a little different, because I think most of us are used to thinking about relationships as like something personal, private, you know, with our friends. And so what Civity is it's really thinking about like what relationships, like how to do relationships with people who are not our friends, right? With people who are members of our community in a way that brings the people, like everybody in the community together. Not like to all be the same or to all be best friends, but to be connected in a way that sort of makes it a whole. And calling out Vivek a little bit, I spend a lot of time in Nebraska, and I think people in rural communities, you know, they run into each other all the time. They have this relationship thing down a little bit more. Those of us who live in urban areas, you know, people who you will see and then you'll never see them again, we just don't really know what that looks like. And so what Civity is about being intentional, about being relational, but not in the like we're going to be best friends and go deep. So the training today is about kind of how to think about that, how to do that, how to be intentional about that. And it is mostly going to be you talking to each other. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking to you, but there is sort of, just because people do like agendas, there is an agenda. And Civity, the organization, which actually grew out of this work, the community work that I was doing in Arlington, we basically do two things. We basically sort of name the importance of Civity, which is this idea that people can be in a culture of respect and empathy for people who are different. You know, we focus a lot on community, which is about being the same. Civity is about difference. And we do trainings to kind of not really teach people stuff that they didn't know already, but to help people pay attention to the kind of practice of how to be with each other. So that's what we're going to do today. Any questions before we get started? Okay. So we're going to start out with, and I apologize, but I am going to look at my phone from time to time because I don't have a watch. And there's no, I'm a teacher sometimes, and there's usually clocks. So I'm going to look at my phone sometimes. So we're going to start out by doing a series of introductions, which is also going to start us focusing on the idea of being intentional about conversation, okay? So what I'm going to ask you to do, because I know Kayla mentioned there's people from different organizations in the room, I'm going to ask you to, we're going to kind of go around. I'm going to ask you to say just your name, what organization you're affiliated with, why you're here, and then something that you do almost every day. Very quickly, something that you do almost every day. And so I just want to sort of think about what you said, and I appreciate you all putting yourselves into the room in this way. But I want to think about being intentional about thinking about what is now in the room and kind of what people said. So, and there's no judgment here. We're just observing, right? So I want you to think about like a scale of levels. So we'll start up here near the surface with level 1. We'll move 2, 3, 4, so sort of down to 10. So I would say, and this is, again, not a judgment, I would say that a 1 really is kind of at the surface of who you are. It doesn't really tell people a lot about who you are, what you think, what you feel. So like drinking coffee is kind of a 1 statement about who you are. It's sort of the personal equivalent of, you know, lovely weather we're having, right? So, I mean, it's courteous, it's but it doesn't really go. So some of the other responses, I listen to music, CNN, being reflective. We're kind of getting a little bit more of a sense of who that person is and kind of where they're coming from, what's going on. It might be a 2, maybe a 3. So if I said, I talk to my husband on the phone every day, it's kind of like at a 2. You learn a little bit more about me. And if I said, we've been doing this kind of not bi-coastal, but Midwest, East Coast for 12 years now, and I'm very careful to stay in contact. That takes what I said down a little bit more. It tells you a little bit more about where I'm coming from, what emotionally, what's going on with me, what my life is about. So what we're going to try to do today in the conversations that we have, we're going to try to be in that kind of 2.5, 3, 3.5 range, right? So why? How did that feel? How did the exercise feel? How did it feel to listen to other people in the room? Come on in, join the circle.
I got very lost.
So I'm going to ask you to do something since you're coming in, and I'm going to ask whoever is signing in to do this as well. We all introduced ourselves with name, organization, and something that we do almost every day.
Oh, wow. Name is Michelle Chang. What was the second?
Organization that you're with.
Challenging racism. And what I do every day, wake up and feed my kids.
Important.
Those are good days.
All right. It's not quite there yet. Excuse me. He'll come.
You should put a name tag on.
I would call him by name. I would say you in. We're going to invite you into the circle. I think you can sit there, or you can sit anywhere. But I'm going to put you on the spot right to begin with.
Sure.
If you could say your name, your organization, and something that you do almost every day.
I'm Andrew Dolan. I'm with Falls Church Young Democrats, and something I do almost every day is I drink too much coffee.
All right, so the coffee theme continues. Thank you very much.
There's coffee in the back, just so everyone knows.
Thanks to you, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So how did it feel to listen to what people were saying and to share something about that you do almost every day? Yeah.
These people all do cooler things than me. I'm very jealous.
I think that really it's a little hard to get below the surface if you ask what you do every day, because pretty much most people's day-to-day lives are pretty mundane.
Mm-hmm.
What's below the surface is not something you get to do every day.
Okay.
I know.
Yeah.
It gives some content to talk about and to learn, like kind of like a hook to learn more about a person.
Mm-hmm. And you can intentionally go down a little bit.
Yeah. I thought also the organization question was also pretty interesting, because you walk into like a Arlington Young Democrats event and you're kind of expecting everybody else to sort of be of that similar vein, but to hear that people are either with an organization or they're with a different Young Democrats group, or challenging racism, I thought that was really, really cool to hear.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to build off of Mark's point, because I think when you introduce people, especially in this area, it's always the question is when you do. And so like hearing something different than that is refreshing.
So it opens up a different part. Did it feel a little risky? No? No? Would it feel a little risky if I asked you to go a little bit deeper?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I want you to be intentional about that. All right, and I'm not asking you to take risks that you're not comfortable with, but I am asking you to sort of go to that place of being genuine and being authentic about what your experience is and kind of who you are, right? Not that anybody wasn't, but just think about that. And, when we're talking about these kinds of relationships of, these sort of public relationships, thinking about this level of sort of 1 to 10, you don't want to be down at like 9 or 10, right? Why?
It's very intimate.
It's can be intimate. And so what is going to happen if you like start out with 9 or 10 with somebody that you're meeting in, you know, in the Arlington Young Dems, or maybe that's where you go, but you know, somebody that you're meeting in a more community-oriented context.
Probably go across boundaries.
You can cross boundaries, make people really uncomfortable, you know, what my kids would call overshare, right? You don't want to be there. But if you continue to talk about the weather all the time, then there's really not a lot of opportunity for that kind of real person-to-person connection. When this is again before many of you were around, I ran for Arlington School Board many years ago. And one of the things I was actually really nervous about was I was nervous about going into crowds and doing small talk, because I'm actually not really very good at small talk. And a very experienced person in the county Democratic Party actually said to me, "Don't worry about it. People will tell you their stories." And you know what? She was absolutely right. And running for office was one of the most amazing experiences because people told me their stories, and immediately there was a connection at a level that was not, you know, lovely weather we're having. Okay, so think about that. Be intentional about where you are. One of the things that research shows is that if you offer a certain level to somebody, like if you, she's nodding over there, people reciprocate, right? If you take that little risk of offering a little bit more of yourself, people respond, okay? And it is a little risky, you know, sharing something that might be a little bit different than what you usually share. But this is a risk we can live with, right? This is not like bungee jumping. Okay? Okay. So what is Civity? So Civity, as I said, is this idea of relationships making a difference in communities, of having I hear somebody's phone, of having the capacity to be intentional about the relationships that we create, and that matters in the community. So it's sort of intentionally going from a kind of us versus them, and that can be any kind of us versus them. But at Civity, we're particularly focused on us versus them, so where there are power differences, right? Race, immigration, ethnicity, etc. And it really is thinking about how we can build a different kind of culture. All right. So simple strategies, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We're going to focus on one-on-one conversations, storytelling, and listening. Really basic stuff. So I want to just take a few minutes before we plunge into the storytelling to think about Civity in Northern Virginia. So if you think about Civity as people connecting with people who are different, think about places that you experience in the work that you do, in the communities that you live in, where this happens. Because partly what we're doing is we're building on stuff that's already happening. It's not like it's completely absent, and it's important to acknowledge what's already here. So, anybody, is this happening at all? People connecting with people who are different, authentically. Yeah.
Northside social, big one for me, but I don't know how different folks are together.
So connecting with people who are
Different.
okay?
There's not
So there are
really-
places where that seems more possible, where it's more kind of happening. The environment allows for it. What else? Yeah.
I live in Falls Church, and there's like a dog park that's right down the street from my apartment, and I don't know how much, you know, kind of class diversity there is there, but there's certainly ethnic and racial and gender diversity, and it seems to be a place where, you know, people can really fall into conversation pretty easily. A lot of them, I think, don't know one another, but their pets are kind of like a starting point for conversation, and they really seem to spend a lot of time there talking to one another, and then people start to come back week after week, and, you know, it's like a community space, the way that in another time period, like a social club might have been.
So there are places that make this, you know, that are sort of set up for this to happen, or there are places where this happens intentionally, where people are intentional about it.
In Arlington, I don't know if this is super well known among a lot of members of the community, but there's this thing called shop talks that was started about 10 years ago, and it's every single month they pick a topic, and anyone from the community can come in, and there's usually like a restaurant will provide like free food or something, and you can sit around and sort of talk about the issue. But I've been to a few of them; they're super interesting.
Yeah, so there are a lot of people out there who are creating spaces, whether they're kind of broad spaces or more focused spaces, where people can actually kind of put differences on the table and connect through those differences. So it's not something that we're making up. There are a lot of people who are on this wavelength. So we're going to start out by not focusing, we're going to get to difference, but we're going to really focus on kind of why you're here today in this room. And we're going to talk about your civic passion. I love the word passion, right? So I think everybody is here in this room today because you care, right? You care to be here, you have a passion about something, whether it's campaigns or whatever it is. And so I'm going to invite you, we're going to get into pairs, we're going to do one-on-one conversations, and I'm going to ask you to tell a story about why you do the work that you do. Like, what is your civic passion and why you do that work? And when I'm going to ask you to find somebody who you don't know particularly well, not your best friend in the AYDs. And the way we're going to do this is that one person is going to tell their story and the other person will just listen. Okay, no questions, just creating that space for the listening. And then we'll switch. Okay, and then we'll have a little bit of time for debrief. But this is really just offering a story, listening to the story, and then switching. Okay, and we have space. You can go outside. We'll let you back in, and so there's lots of you can move the chairs around. But I want to start because I'm firmly of the belief that I shouldn't ask you to do anything that I'm not willing to do myself. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about sort of the civic passion that I have and the work that I do. So I told you that I ran for school board in Arlington. It was 1997, and that I had this amazing experience of people sharing their stories with me. And my story really changed as I heard people's stories. My story about the school changed and the schools overall. And then I lost, right? Not everybody wins. I lost. And I ended up I was the co-chair. They don't have presidents of the PTA or the Drew Model School Association at Drew Model School in Knock in South Arlington. I'm a white person, and my kids are biracial, and a lot of the parents were different races. And I was like, there were a lot of issues going on, program issues, building issues, and I got to December of the first year that I was co-chair, and I was like, I am spending all my time on the phone talking to people. And I had this blinding realization that was the point, right? That I was supposed to be spending my time on the phone talking to people. That a lot of what the issues were at Drew was that people were not talking to each other, right? White parents weren't talking to African American parents, weren't talking to Hispanic parents, parents weren't talking to the administration and the teachers, nobody was talking to people in the neighborhood. It was just like nobody was having conversations. And it just really struck me that those conversations and the stories that I was hearing, because I was hearing a lot of stories about the history of Drew, the history of the neighborhood, that those stories, those conversations, those relationships were what would make it possible for us to move forward. And so that passion that I have for stories and conversation really came from those experiences at Drew. So I'm going to ask you to find a partner. We're going to take a total of maybe a little bit more than 5 minutes for this. And one of you will start, and I'm going to let you do it. Okay?
Here, I'm Mark. Good.
I had never received that in a training or a learning exercise before, and it was just really, really helpful, because sometimes, I'm it's either like I'm very superficial and connecting, just like, yeah, hey, how you doing? And I'm originally from the Midwest and like talking how the weather is, how you're doing today, right? That conversation, or the opposite side of the bell curve where I want to connect like too deep. But finding like a middle ground where I could have a deep sense of community without, having to become overcommitted.
I went first, and what I found so amazing is I was kind of speaking the generic AYD language, like the generic language that I'm familiar with, just telling my story. What I was kind of blown away with is that because I had more time to operate with, I ran out of things. Normally my speech is like an elevator speech. It takes 30 seconds, and I ran through it, and then I didn't have anything to talk about, so I had to start further back. And I ended up restarting a couple times just because there was this extended availability. There was this extended gap where I could actually tell my story in a new way, and it allowed me to really think about myself and think about my story in a greater context, which was really wonderful. And at the end, the person I was working with said, yeah, I feel like we're speaking the same language. And then she went into her story, and what was so great about it is it was vastly different from mine. I learned so much about this person and how they came to be in this room sitting across the table from me. And we were speaking the same language, even though we came from completely different backgrounds and we had different stories. She was right. We did know each other in a way.
How was that storytelling? First of all, how was it to share your story? How was it to share your own story?
Good.
Good. Okay. How was it? Yeah, Maureen?
It's like hard to dig that deep to like pinpoint such a meta kind of thing about yourself of like, why do I do what I do? Rather than just being like, well, like I do it because I care about it, but like, why do I care about it? Okay, like it requires a lot more thinking to get to that point. You yourself have to go deeper to answer that kind of question, to tell that story to somebody else, right? Somebody else had it, yes.
I find that there's a little bit of an awkwardness. You put a lot of time into thinking about your own identity and, what is your origin story as an activist or whatever, and you think that sounds pretty good, and then you say it out loud and you're like, oh, this doesn't sound as cool as I thought it did. Like it sounds fine, but I was picturing it like a book flap, author description. When it comes out, it's just like, oh, I'm just trying to put words together. So.
Yeah, well, whenever you tell a story, you are taking a risk, right? You're putting yourself out there, whatever level you're at, and that has to do with how you tell the story as well as the content of the story. So yeah, Mike.
Talking to Dan the man back here, we had like very separate issues that were like near and dear to our heart. But like talking to Dan, it was almost like looking in the mirror because the theme was the same, but the end result was different. But yeah, the root cause or the root theme or why we both got involved was very, very similar. So I found that really enlightening.
So we're all human, and so a lot of what motivates us is kind of the same, and it leads us in different directions depending on what our experiences are and where we live and etc. But stories help us connect to that, not only for ourselves, which is what Maureen was talking about, but to kind of share that with other people. So how was it to listen? I mean, Mike's already started on this, but how was it to listen to the other person's story? Yeah.
I find that my natural conversation is always to probe and ask other questions on top of it. So having to restrain yourself from doing that is sort of hard.
Mm-hmm. So and what's the different dynamic there? Because there is definitely a dynamic when you're probing and asking the question versus just sitting back, not sitting back, but creating that space for that listening space for the other person to tell their story. There's a very different dynamic there. What is that? Yeah.
I don't know. I think for me at least, when you're sort of probing and asking the question, you kind of feel like you're on the spot in your head. You're like, okay, so they're saying this, what? You're sort of forming that that very specific script. It's like, okay, they're saying this. What would be a great question to ask them next? But when you're sitting back and sort of listening, it's like, okay, let me just take in the information.
Okay, so there's a couple things about that, right? So when you're sitting there thinking, okay, what am I going to ask them next? What is your focus on? Yourselves. Like, oh, what am I going to ask them next, right? Rather than really listening. And one of the things that I've found in this kind of listening is that it actually is really freeing in a lot of ways to just say, I'm just gonna listen. I'm not gonna feel like I have to be on the spot to think about what I'm gonna say next. I'm just gonna listen and really pay attention to what they're saying. The other thing about asking a lot of questions is that you're really directing the conversation, right? You're really directing the story. Whereas when you create the space for somebody else to tell their story, they really have control over the story. So you're just creating the space. And you know, I do conflict resolution work. One of the most effective strategies for getting people to kind of talk is silence. And really partly what you're doing in creating that listening space is just being silent and allowing them at their own pace and in their own way to generate and tell the story that they're. Anything else about listening? The process of listening, Michelle?
I've gotten into the habit when I do this exercise, and it's an attitude. It's not like I have a checklist in my head, but the question I always start, that I always open myself up to when I'm listening in this way, is to say, what is going to surprise me from this person? And then, like I said, it's an attitude. It's not like I have a checklist that like, that didn't surprise me, that didn't surprise me. But it's more of a, wow, that just out of the blue as a human being saying that surprises me. You know, that intrigues me. And I just kind of hold on to that. And that's what happened with Brandon, is that after he told me his story, I was able to reflect back to him that which I found the most surprising or the most intriguing about what he said. And a lot of times that has the result of a mirror, like a mirror effect, where they then can see something about themselves reflected in you that they didn't know about themselves. And so then it becomes almost a different conversation. It goes a different place, I suppose.
So taking that and kind of going to the next question I was going to ask, which is like, what is that process of sharing stories? So there's a process of you thinking, digging into yourself, generating your own story and telling it. There's the process of listening to the other person's story. So how was that to kind of be in that shared story telling, listening space together? And Michelle's already kind of started us down that road. Yeah, Haley?
I found that I really rely on people to ask more questions when I'm talking. I have a really hard time just talking about myself, and so I feel like I don't have much to offer. So I think when people are not asking questions, I'm like, oh, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, Brandon?
Yeah, to follow up on that, like, I'm so used to being interrupted all the time. And it's such a pet peeve, but like being able to have the opportunity just to let it go, I kind of felt the same way, where it was just like a little awkward, where it was just like, I'm not really sure what I should say next, but then I just said what came to mind next, and watching, my true story unfold in front of me in a way that I've never processed myself.
One of my students, when I first started doing this work, kind of playing around with these kinds of conversations, I was teaching at Georgetown at the time, and I was sending my students out to go do these kinds of conversations out, not just with people in the class, but out. And my students are all like, oh, this is going to be so weird. And one of my students came back and she said, and I've never forgotten this, she said, I was so surprised by how willing people were to share their story. She said, people are hungry to be heard. People are hungry to be heard. And if you create the space for them to be heard, and I think that Haley, your experience of, because people, we are in this rhythm of people asking questions, people being interrupted, people not listening to other people, that when you really create the space for listening, people are a little like, oh, wait a minute, this is a little strange. But if you really are there with that kind of listening presence, people really respond, because people really are hungry to be heard. And it is a really, really powerful thing. Anything else about the kind of process of telling these stories, seeing yourself reflected to some degree? What happened out of that conversation? You feel like you know this person a little bit better, a little bit differently? How was that conversation effectively? What was the effect of this conversation in terms of the relationship between the two of you? Yeah, Jan.
I'll just say it felt like a gift in a way to have a bit of a deeper conversation. And while it was awkward because we're both used to being prompted, the empty spaces gave us time to be more authentic. And like for me, to stop the chatter, because I love asking questions, it's natural. But it gave me a chance to just kind of be quiet in my mind and not assume or not help somebody. It was like empowering the other person to be fully present.
Yeah. And when you offer your presence, then people are present in return. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to build on that. Like, I think the phrase "fully present" speaks to it well, because if you think about it, you can probably fit most conversations you have into like 2 or 3 buckets. We're all politicos, so talking shop is one of them. So, like social chit chat is another one, and then networking, where you're always kind of trying to find, okay, what's my foothold to, sort of inject myself a little bit more into this conversation and hook the other person. And when you're constantly thinking of those things, anticipating what's the smartest thing I can say next, you're not allowing as much space in your own mind, I think, to listen to the other person.
And when you do this process of listening and then telling your story, then a connection happens, right? And it's not a deep connection. We're not best friends, not the BFF, but there is like an authentic, like that was a real story about a real person, right? And that's what we're looking for. This is the kind of exchange you can have with somebody that you encounter anywhere, right? Somebody had their hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually really helpful because I misunderstood authenticity, like connecting at the 8, 9, and 10 level with somebody. So, when I'm used to somebody asking my story, it's just like, whoop, time swan dive. And it was actually really helpful just staying in that 2 to 3 range, but being able to tell that true, deep story and connect on an authentic level.
Right. It doesn't, just because we're at the 3 level doesn't mean that that's not meaningful to us, right? And that being like the civic passion or other kinds of things, that is meaningful to us. That is genuine and authentic. But it isn't that intimate deep dive that we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting, the exercise I thought was interesting because I'm used to sharing my story. I'm used to telling not just my story, but stories in general. And it was interesting to be in that position of actively listening and creating space for somebody else to tell their story.
So, thank you. And I wanted to, like I said, mostly what we're going to do is we're going to do exercises, and we're going to plunge into another one in a couple of minutes. But I wanted to, I started out by just observing where Civity is happening already in Northern Virginia and in our lives. And I just wanted to kind of take a minute to kind of name something that Kayla and I talked about when we talked about doing this, is about the work that you all do. This is a political room by and large. And kind of this idea of shifting from transactional interactions with people to relational interactions with people. And I was kind of Googling around yesterday, and I came across, I was mentioning this to Vivek earlier, I came across this thing that like the Democrats are now starting to do, like relational canvassing. I'm like, relational canvassing, like what is that? But they're like talking this language, like moving from transactional to relational. So like, what is that? That is canvassing with a potential voter. This is not just with potential voters, it's with potential other people that you meet in the community, where instead of being transactional, I want your vote, I want your this, I want your that. It's like, so who is this person that I'm interacting with? And what is that kind of authentic, where they're coming from? Because you can actually have a relational interaction, an authentic relational interaction, in a very short period of time, and not go to that deep, deep level, right? And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Okay. So I want to just talk a little bit about kind of the theory behind Civity, and there's a handout. Civity is really based on this idea that micro interactions matter at the big level, at the kind of community system level. And, I'm sure you've all heard of microaggressions, right? So there's a kind of some researchers who have coined the term micro-inclusions, right? So that this idea that we can send messages that are, you don't belong messages in the twinkling of an eye, very subtly. We can also send messages that say, I see you, you belong here. You're part of my group, you're part of my community, right? And so again, it's a sort of being intentional about those. So when you walk down the street, you have a very different feeling when you walk down the street when people are sending you those microaggression messages, walking to the other side, looking the other way, versus, hey, how you doing? Making a comment, right? Those little things matter. And if you add all of those up, lots of people, lots of interactions, then the culture changes, right? That's the kind of the theory behind Civity, and there's actually research behind it. But our focus is not just on the kinds of stories that you had. I suspect that a lot of your civic passions are really similar, but our focus is on difference, right? So there's kind of being intentional. That was the first part of what we did, the introductions of, where are we going to be? There's the being authentic. That's the stories that we've already done. The third part is really putting difference on the table, and that's where we're going to, where we're going to go now. So I want to, I actually have a little bit of something to work on this. But I want you to think for a minute. We'll do just sort of some shouting out of what in this community, in your community, what keeps people apart? What identities, categories keep people apart? And we're particularly focused here on identities or categories that have to do with, as I said at the beginning, power differential. It's okay, right? So what are the differences that keep us apart?
Race.
Race, absolutely foundational. What else? Socioeconomics, the have-not divide, and that's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. What else? Religion.
Sexuality and gender.
Okay. Gender orientation, sexuality. Education, absolutely related to the socioeconomics, yeah. Urban, rural, big one.
In Arlington, north-south.
North-south, yeah. Geography.
Healthcare.
Do we have it or we don't? Healthy or not? Okay, so I want you you have a picture. I'd say immigration, right? Another one. I want you to take a minute, and I want you to think for yourself. What are the 4 categories that you think keep us apart in your experience? Okay, so we've heard a bunch. I want you to pick 4 and just write them on the sheet. Okay. I have 1 pen. You can share.
Here, I'm done.
Yeah, this is quick. This is not. It's not a long thing. This is just writing down the categories. Extra sheets. Here's one. Thank you. So what I'm going to ask you to do when you're done with your 4, so I'm going to ask you to get up, and I'm going to ask you to find someone who has a difference, who is different from you, from one of the differences on your chart, okay? Which is going to take a little bit of time. And once you find that person, and you might need to, negotiate a little bit, sort of ask some questions, compare categories, etc. I'm going to ask you to do the same the same thing that we did before with the stories. I'm going to ask you to tell a story about that difference, okay? One person tells a story about that difference. The other person tells a story about that difference. And again, on the not asking you to do anything that I am not willing to do myself, I will tell you a story about race. As I mentioned to you before, my husband's African American, my kids are biracial. I was I would say, fairly clueless white person when we got married and started having kids. And I realized that race was going to be a big issue in my life. And one of the things that I have found is that just naming being white is actually one of the most important things for me about dealing with race and sort of starting from that point and going forward. So that's a story about a difference that is one of the most germane differences in our community. So we're going to do the same thing, but like I say, find somebody who's different from you and then each tell a story about that difference. Okay? We good? All right, go for it.
I talked about experiences. I grew up in a very rural area. And it's kind of, I mentioned to my conversation partner that everything's kind of homogenous. The culture's already formed for you. Your future's already identified, your way of living, everything. At the age of 18, I moved to San Antonio, Texas, a little more liberal than the rural area that I grew up in. And I was able to form my own impressions, make my own decisions, challenge the status quo, and then develop my own tolerance for people and identities that I wasn't aware of. So.
Well, yeah, let's talk about race. And he started it off with like, so how's it being white? And it was like, well, pretty good. But we also talked about kind of the spectrum of awareness that a lot of white people have about the level of privilege. And I was really fortunate to be raised with a family that really valued diversity. And so I actually transferred out of schools that were predominantly white, very well funded, into schools on the other side of the county that were far more diverse, majority minority schools that had really phenomenal people, phenomenal teachers, but were considered quite often to be like the less good schools. And so that was a really formative experience for me. And so I shared that with Bo, and he was, talking about, so how do other white people react when you interact with them about these kind of things? And I was like, well, some people really get it and they're on the same page and they want to be having the same conversations about, what has my privilege done for me? And then there's other people who fundamentally are just like, what are you talking about? And they really don't get it. So that was what I shared with him, and we really reflected on kind of the vast spectrum of awareness of race that people who benefit from it have. And then he shared with me about how being black means so many different things, even within the black or African American community, and that light skin versus dark skin is a big difference. People who are black but well off versus black and poor is so different, and that he said that he really loves who he is and his identity and feels really good about it, but that he doesn't always get that reaction from other people. And so, I think it's interesting to see just the number of differences in between, we had that difference of being like, I'm white, he's black, but even within our communities that we say are different from each other, there's differences between me and other people who are white, and between him and other people who are black. And it's not just two homogenous groups that, I'm on one side, you're on the other side, and we're all in the same place.
So how was that? How was that? Pretty good. Oh, come on, the good, pretty good. How was that? How did that feel? How was that different from the first storytelling? Yes.
It was deeper.
It is.
Yeah.
Why?
So it was interesting because for me it was like a back and forth. Like for Eric and I, we kind of went we talked about like a couple things, like he identified one or two in mind that we had a discussion about, and then we talked about his as well, and it felt like I was a little bit more exposed, I think, when we were talking, which was a little bit scary, but also kind of empowering in a way, because I felt like this was a safe place where we could like actually discuss these kinds of things. So that was really nice.
So why does this feel a little riskier? I mean, I might be restating the obvious, but why does this feel riskier? Because it usually does. Yeah, Kayla?
Well, I think for me, when I have a conversation with people, especially surrounded by Democrats all the time, I'm always talking to people who agree with me. And like I'm having a conversation, and it's easy to talk about things that you think the same. It's really hard because you knew this was going to be different. So sometimes it's hard to have that conversation, that knowing that the other person is coming from a different viewpoint.
Yeah.
And going off of that, like the first question where we were talking one-on-one about like, oh, what got you civically involved? Well, we're all civically involved. So it's like your story is going to be pretty similar, or at least you'll be able to understand. Like you'll definitely be able to like, oh yeah, like I get that. Whereas if you're talking like I was talking about sexual orientation, he was talking about growing up in a rural community and then moving to a very urban one. These are like things that we don't share. So it kind of challenges you a bit more. You have to think about it a little bit more, and like think about even explaining your own version. You have to think about it more.
So why don't we share them? Because we don't. Why don't we share these things generally? Yeah.
I mean, it's like really abstract and it can't be more specific, but it has just a lot to do with vulnerability, whether it's like an admission of privilege, or it's just being vulnerable about, painful experiences that, maybe you feel like defined your life. And so, or maybe both. And I think just every culture is different, and I've noticed particularly here in the States, vulnerability is not something that people want to actively engage in all the time, and it's something to avoid. And that, I don't mean that as a critique, I'm just like, it's just an observation that we're not like as children like taught about mental health and how to talk about these things, and so I mean it permeates into our whole culture and why we're.
So what happens when we as we do in this storytelling exercise, when we put those differences on the table? We just put them on the table. What's the effect of that? Yeah.
I think we kind of talked about this in our discussion, but I think it gives you a little bit of exposure, and then it helps you like build a little bit of tolerance and maybe empathy with where that person is coming from. Like I talked a lot about growing up in a rural community, and like everything's homogenous, like your culture, your identity is already formed. But then once I left that rural community, I was able to form my own impressions based off of like people that I met. So I guess you get more exposure and build your own tolerance and understanding of different cultures possibly.
How is it to tell a story about that difference? Yeah.
It can be challenging because I think it requires you to reveal some of your own like blind spots or shortcomings.
How was it to listen to somebody tell a story about their difference? What were you, as you listened to that, what were you perceiving? Yeah, Corey.
I think for me, as someone who is very hesitant a lot of times to share my story, I think it's helpful to see someone to be able to share theirs, because it's like, oh wow, I can do that too.
Mm-hmm. It's that reciprocal thing. It's like people reciprocate. Yeah. Other.
Yeah, I loved receiving the stories, things I don't really think about, and it was just like really nice, like hearing something so different from myself and my experience.
So, a lot of times, when we meet somebody, we're always looking for the similarities. It's like, where'd you go to school, where'd you grow up, and we bond through those similarities. And then, of course, because we're not clones, we discover lots of differences, right? We sort of start with that similarity, and then we build the differences, which is, after all, what makes the world interesting. If we were all clones, life would be pretty dull. And what going through the difference does is it sort of puts things in reverse. A lot of times we avoid differences, particularly differences like sexual orientation or race or immigration or religion, because we've been sort of taught to not go there. But if we put it on the table, it kind of demystifies it. It's like, okay, well, we're just gonna put it on the table. And then what you find is that if you hear somebody's story about a difference, you realize that there's a lot of similarity, right? There's a lot of similarity in terms of people's experiences of dealing with privilege, of dealing with not privilege, of dealing with, all kinds of human experiences, because in fact we're all human. And so you find the similarities, but you go in through the differences. So it's a different way to kind of get to that point, going through something that a lot of times we just sort of like, we just don't go there. Any other, yeah, Matthew?
So at least for me, I kind of went into this because the one that I sort of led with, I was like, I don't think that people, I didn't think that other people were gonna bring this up, and at least for me, it was sort of like education experience. Like, did you go to community college? Did you go to? Because I've noticed with a lot of my friends that go to community college, they feel kind of isolated because a lot of their friends from high school have kind of moved on to college and are out there doing things, at least, and then when they come back home, they're hanging out with a lot of their friends from college, not from community college. But talking to, Izzy? Yeah, she sort of brought up the fact that experience is something that can kind of divide us, and that was kind of what I was trying to get at. And I thought like, that's not one of the four that people are going to bring up, but I kind of realized talking to her, hey, it's something that people do kind of find is an issue.
So what were the differences so we had urban rural, we had sexual orientation, I think you mentioned, experience and education. What were the ones that you actually shared the stories about? Religion?
Health status.
Health status? Race?
Language.
That's one we hadn't talked about, yeah. Education? Okay.
Age.
Yeah.
Presentation of self.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think, so like in this exercise, we are all like inherently vulnerable, like open, and you might be getting to this, but how do you, let's say like reach across the aisle when that person is defensive and they have their guard up and there's no way that you feel like you're gonna be able to reach them? Like, what is the strategy for that?
So one of the big strategies behind Civity is and the use of stories is actually that, when we're kind of up here in our heads, and which is where people often are when they're defensive. So it's like, I disagree with you because I'm here and you're here. And one of the things that stories do is that they get you to a different place, right? So if somebody's whatever it is that they're defensive about. So if I ask a question, and questions are an important part, even though we're focusing on silence and listening, questions are important. How did you come to that? Not what are your reasons for that, but kind of what is the story? What is the life experience? So because we're all human, life experiences really resonate. They're very similar. Even if they're different from ours, we can kind of like, oh, that's similar to an experience that I've had. So the stories get us often to a place where we can empathize, understand, connect with somebody who really has a different view than ours. The point here is not to erase the difference. The point is not to agree. This is not like a conflict resolution kind of thing. It's about finding some sort of potential understanding or connection of a person that you might be really different from. And that difference might be one that is a positional defensiveness kind of thing. It might just be sort of or not just be, but it might be a deep identity, like who I am at my core kind of a thing, which we also often don't talk about. But stories do, it doesn't work, 100% of the time, but stories do have a way of creating a connection across what could be that sort of defensiveness divide.
I want to expound on your answer and ask you if I'm just echo and see if I'm understanding. So you think maybe like when you ask a person, how did you get there with your story, it kind of gets them to stop thinking about the thing they're disagreeing with, and now they got to think about how they got there. And some is there and actually wants to listen, and so that maybe that's how the barrier gets lowered, or is it?
So, I think I said at the beginning, this is, we operate and we are trained to operate in our heads a lot. We talk about, I think this about this, this is my view about this. And what this is doing is it's getting us to a place of, it's kind of moving from the head to the heart. It's like, so what is my human experience that led to that? I'm not, in asking that question, I'm actually not as interested in sort of where you ended up as in the kind of human process by which you got there and kind of where that started. And that is a place where we're much more likely to connect. And again, it's not that you are going to necessarily get on the same page with, agree with, or et cetera, or certainly have the same identity as somebody who's really got a different identity than yours. That's not the point. The point is to say, in addition to these differences, there's this commonality of human experience that I can connect through story, because we are all human at that level. So it's not an either or, it's more like a both and. It's like, yes, we agree, or yes, we disagree, yes, we're different, and we are also connected. We're also fellow human beings. And that's what this story sort of thread adds to things. Does that make sense? It's a really, really powerful tool, actually. And so, the kind of the three things that we've done are being intentional, sort of thinking about those levels and thinking like, where do I want to be? How can I connect to be genuine? Telling the story, like where you're coming from, what you care about, and then putting difference on the table. That's it. So what I want to do now is we have a little bit more time, and I want to take the time to think about how can you use this in the work that you do? How can you use this in the work that you do? So I'm going to offer a couple of suggestions, and then I'm going to ask you to get in small groups and just kind of brainstorm for a little bit. So one suggestion is that we work with, Civity works with leaders in communities around the country, and one of the tools that we found that leaders do is leaders convene groups a lot of the time, right? You have meetings. One of the things that you can do is to create Civity space at the beginning of a meeting, to have that opportunity for people to connect relationally. Okay, just 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It's like relationships are important, we're gonna do this. Another is that many of you reach out to and network, but create relationships with people in the community, many of whom are different from you. I have found over the years that having like a one-on-one conversation that is a Civity conversation that really focuses on exchanging stories, being intentional, putting difference on the table is an amazing way to build an authentic relationship with somebody in my community. So that's more of a personal kind of expanding the network in a way. So those are two options that I'll offer you. I'm going to ask you to spend maybe 5-10 minutes, I think we have, get in groups of maybe 3 or 4, and just like where are you situated? What's the work that you do? How could I use this in the work that I do? Vivek, do you have a question?
Yeah, just before we sort of start, because it's adding, I think it's really important that you talk about creating the Civity space at the start of a meeting. The reason I sort of say this is Jan and I, we spend a lot of time in the southwest of Virginia, and what we find, we attend a lot of meetings, all of us do at work in Northern Virginia, and then we attend a lot of meetings down in the southwest. One thing that we found really striking down there, which we've never seen up here in Northern Virginia, is everybody introduces themselves and they ask everyone to talk about a book they've read, what food they love, something really personal, and in a way it's actually relation building, right? So I think your point, something as simple as just going a little beyond to find common ground with something as easy as food or music, I find that a standard practice when we go down there. That's the start of every conversation, so it's really nice that you said.
And it does, my Civity partner, who I co-founded Civity with, Malka Kopel, is a long-time facilitator. She does sophisticated facilitations on really tough public policy issues. She's a policy wonk. And she came to this because she found that in those really tough discussions, really nothing happens until people see each other as people and have those relationships. And she's like, it's never intentional. It always just happens because people have been meeting. Why not be intentional and break that out and do the relationship building that you know is important to actually dealing with the issues that are on the table, right? So I think that what Vivek's saying is, I mean, and there are many, many ways to create that city space in the context of other processes or meetings. So 3 to 4 people, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Just think about how this could be useful, okay?
Talking about how was it that we were going to implement, Civity, the Civity training and our advocacy work. This being the second time I've done this training, because Palma is amazing, and it was really cool to see how everyone sort of took their own way on how they're going to apply it, and yet there was a lot of similarities on why we were going to implement it that way, what our objective was. Just really wanting to set up our activities, whether they're meetings, board meetings, general body meetings, or someone working on a campaign, or just sort of working out differences amongst their members, or just the people having really strong stances on issues, that just having the civility to really start every engagement with 5, 10, 15 minutes of just civility talk, getting personal, and really getting down to just sort of who you are, so that you get a chance to get to know someone, so that when you down the line in a meeting or engagement, whatever it is you're in, you're set up to understand the person when you disagree with them, and jumping to understanding rather than jumping to just really focusing on how you're different and how you disagree.
And so hearing how we're going to go back into their work and communities and apply what we learned. And I think for me, it helped me process what I learned and be able to process a little bit more of how I can apply this idea of being intentional and listening and advocating for people more in my daily life, whether it's at work or in my community or in volunteering. And so it was just an interesting experience and extremely meaningful to be able to engage people that aren't in my realm of influence, and be able to hear their experiences and what they learn and how they're growing from being able just to discuss being authentic and talking to people. So,
like someone was saying, in their meetings, everyone's jumping straight to the solution and not agreeing on what the facts are, and why people believe what they believe. And I desperately need that in the work I'm doing. So just goosebumps all around, yeah.
So ideas. I heard a lot of great conversations. How can you use this approach in your work? Yes.
So I was actually lucky enough to be in a conversation with these 3 guys, and it was a lot of fun. But Paul and I were both talking. He's the co-president, I believe now, yeah? Along with Bo of the Fairfax Young Dems, and I'm the president of the Arlington Young Dems. And we were both talking about how we can include these in our general body meetings at the beginning every month, kind of just talking about our differences, kind of coming to the table as really authentic people before we get into whatever we're talking about.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the same vein, one of the things that the Arlington chapter has kind of struggled with is integrating new people into such an established group where it feels kind of oh, well, everyone else knows each other, and new people who come in, it's well, I don't know all of the inside stuff, and I think that starting off our meetings or just when we have new people coming and just initiating kind of an intentional, planned, almost like college orientation, feeling activity, just at the first 5 minutes, just to kind of break the ice and be we're all on the same level. We want everyone to be included in this conversation. I think that could go a long way.
You know, one of the things, and you're both kind of describing this, is that, you know, one of the, how to describe this, it's like one of the things that you can do as leaders in that kind of context is create the structure for this to happen. And, you know, people often are, it's hard to create your own structure, or it's harder to do something like this when you're kind of making it up, or there's no structure. And I found, like I said, when I did this kind of work where I had my students going out to do Civity conversations, they found that even saying to somebody, oh, you know, I'd like to set up a meeting because, you know, I have this assignment, even that little bit of structure, it's like gives people permission to take the space to do that. So that when you're doing that in a meeting, where you're like, okay, so we're gonna take this 5 minutes, or we're gonna take this 10 minutes, and this is what we're going to do, you're giving people permission by creating that structure for them. And that makes it easier for people to do that. Whereas if they were sitting there, you know, some of us would jump into the conversation with those other folks. Some of us, like me, would be like, oh, you know, that's, and creating that structure, then people go into it much more easily. It's really important. Other thoughts, ideas? Yeah.
I thought,
Kellen, sorry, I thought Kellen brought up a good point. You know, for him, it wasn't even just, oh, like I have an organization, like I do, and like Young Dems do. It's also just meeting people around the office, because he's going into a new job in New York soon, and he's just trying to, you know. So I thought that was an interesting thing for me to think about. Of just like, you know, it's not just, you know, this sort of formal, like, we're going to have a meeting and we're going to talk about this issue. It's also just meeting people in public. Like, think about these things.
And we can be, we can be intentional about that kind of relationship building. I mean, in this context, we're talking about it more in the community context, but this approach to being relational can absolutely apply in a workplace or in lots of other contexts, because, you know, we are just, again, we're kind of programmed to be very transactional and very head oriented, and people respond to. And it's not an instead of, it's in addition to. People really respond to being treated as human beings and having that acknowledged. Other ideas? Yeah, Denver.
Yeah, so with governance and elected officials, unfortunately the campaign process, I think, has made a sickness in governments, where we want to, let me do something flashy, make sure I have your vote, make sure I keep your attention, make sure I'm doing something that makes me look good for you to be interested in me, instead of me connecting to you on a personal level saying, what can I do? Sam Razul did this nonprofit across the state. He called, like, hey, what can the Virginia state government do for you? And everyone thought it was revolutionary, but at the end of the day, that's your job, right? Like, you're an elected official, you should be connected with your neighbors saying, what can the state do for you? And having these conversations, just knocking these doors, going to senior homes, going to, you know, community facilities, and being like, hey, what are your issues? Like, we have people contact our office or complaining that the road hasn't been paved in 5 years, but I know there are people who don't have electricity, who don't have food in our community, who do not contact our office. And we're being distracted by those who are concerned about a pothole when someone's livelihood is on the edge, because they're not engaged and we don't actually have these conversations with our community and our neighbors.
Well, and I think there are two things about what Deborah's saying that I think are incredibly important. One is going to where people are, you know, rather than sort of always, this is something I learned in my PTA days, you know, you can send out like, come to the meeting. It's like, people are like, nah, no thanks. If you go to where people are in their own space where they're comfortable. Many people aren't comfortable coming to another space, but if you go there, like if I set up a meeting, I'll always say, what works for you, because I'm going to their space, and that makes a huge difference. The other thing is that you really do hear from people not to belabor, but I remember when I was running for school board, there was a principal at WNL who had been there for and I mean, I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said, you know, that principal at WNL, I mean, wasn't on my radar screen before, but you hear things through those stories that are really important to hear. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan.
So I had a sort of similar problem to what you were addressing, Denver, which is that I've been working for Canon. I've been talking to a lot of folks on the doors for the last couple of months, and you know, we ask that question, you know, in every conversation, what are your issues? And most of the time, people won't answer. Like I just get nothing. Right? Like, I don't-
So I'm wondering if there's maybe a different question
Well,
that
what
you
do you,
might ask.
I mean, I try not to ask what is your issue, but like, what is, I've worked for a supervisor candidate in Prince William County. So I ask people, is there something, either what is of concern to you in your neighborhood, or what is something you think a supervisor can do to you, or for you, or what is something in your community that concerns you? And these are all sort of different versions of the question I've been trying to,
So here's that. So let me just off the cuff. Let me suggest a question. What's your experience living in Fairfax County, or what is your experience? How do you feel about living in this neighborhood and whatever? Because a lot of times people may not have a concern, but part of what you want to hear is kind of where they're coming from, and a question about issues or concerns, really well-meaning in the sense of you really want to know, but sometimes the best question is the question that allows them to frame the story that they're telling.
Okay. I mean, I guess, so for my concern, so I'm working in Prince William County, the area, which is currently has a Republican majority board. The representative in the district that I'm working in is currently a Republican. He's no longer running. And so I guess it gets to your point about transactionality. People who are happy with the government that they have that's not what I want. I want people who aren't happy and want to change. Right? So I don't want to belabor this, but I think that you can also go into it with the attitude of I'm trying to create relationships with people generally. Yeah.
And that's the sort of the precursor to that, I want people who are going to change. And it's not an either or. It's a potentially a both and.
Can I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
Because it really spoke to me when you said that. Because I sit on the board for an LGBTQ+ music ensembles nonprofit based in DC, the DMV area members, and we're doing this inclusivity initiative because we have problems with inclusion. Surprise. Within whatever. So, and through 18 and a half hours of interviews with 9 members and trying to really dig deep into what their experience is. Sometimes they said, yeah, no, I don't have a problem, this is great. But as I kept on digging and being as open-ended as possible, they ended up going, oh, actually, yeah, I just noticed, I really didn't like this. I did have this negative experience. And so just opening up and trying was a little digging a little bit for negative experiences because we're having issues, but just sort of opening up and being just having them think about it and sit down and think about their story, they actually found, I'm having good and bad experiences here. So just hearing them.
Yeah, it's great.
So something, and I kind of talked about this in our group a little bit, but something that I think I struggle with, and kind of going off of, your name, Dan, but what you were saying, and you as well, is I feel like the people we hear from a lot are the people, it's the same people, and the people who we need to hear from, one, don't speak because they don't think that anyone can offer them anything or help them because they're so used to putting up walls or fighting for themselves or having their family fight for them, not a complete stranger. And so they don't in a lot of ways know how to communicate their needs because they've never had to or they've never been asked to. And so it's if someone says what's your issue, I think I think of my dad growing up. He would have never even known what to communicate because it's everything. He needed help with everything, but he never had anyone to ask them. And it's this lack of fundamental understanding that your representative or all of these people who it's their jobs to help you, they don't know that they can help you. So they don't even know how to even have that conversation. So I think that's when you put that aside for a second and just get to the relationship. I think we are there to connect a bridge to even tell them here's what you need, here's your issue, here's how we can help you. But almost having that conversation, us knowing the end goal and helping them get there without actually asking them these questions that we know how to answer, because we all have this conversation on a daily basis, but they don't know that. And those are the people I think that we all, at the end of the day, like want to like get at. Does that make sense?
Well, I think that, you know, in a lot of like processes where people are working on issues and, you know, you need to have people's voices in the room, a lot of times having like a one-on-one conversation, particularly with people who aren't used to having their voices in the room, gives people the opportunity to figure out what their story is, because sometimes, just like you guys, you don't really know what your story is until somebody really asks you for your story. And so creating and I think that, you know, writ large, that's what you guys are talking about, is like lots and lots of people out there whose stories aren't maybe even really identified or articulated even to themselves, because there's really never been the space. It hasn't seemed relevant or important. And so creating that space one-on-one, because everybody, I mean, I've been teaching for a long time, and I have students who will raise their hand, you know, when there's 150 students, and then, you know, there are more students who will raise their hand when there's 40 students, and if there's 10 students, there's gonna still be that one student who is a little bit uncomfortable raising their hand and talking. But in a one-on-one situation, almost everybody is comfortable talking. So if you create that one-on-one space for people, almost everybody will, you know, get over that hurdle of, you know, I'm here to, you know, I'm here to be heard. Yes.
I found, especially in the political spectrum, that one of the biggest issues for a lot of people, especially younger folks, is accessibility. When you have these fundraisers that cost $250 to get in, and that's like your intimate setting of getting close to an elected official, that really doesn't make you feel like you even have a voice or a say in things. So, I mean, when I ran this last campaign, my biggest thing was like, when folks wanted to have meet and greets, I was like, okay, go find 10 or 15 people that don't go to political events and tell them to come over and we'll have a conversation. Because I felt that when you are speaking in these silos, that's really when you have a lot of issues, when you're just like, okay, all of my opinions are validated and I don't need to talk to anybody else because I'm right, obviously. But then when you're opening that area to other people and then listening and being like, you know, one of the biggest examples of that was when one of the issues we were constantly talking about was renters' rights. And then I was at this one event and this woman interrupted my candidate and was like, well, what about the landlords? Because they, you know, sometimes get screwed over too. And we hadn't even been thinking about that. We're like, all right, we have to go back and reassess now because that is an issue that we didn't really think about. So just opening it up to a wider range of people, I think really helps you better yourself and then continue to have like a more meaningful conversation.
I mean, if you're only hearing from kind of one story, then there's like this larger story that often you're missing, and you know, part of it is like, who has the other parts of that story? You can't listen to everybody, but it, you know, it is this like, so whose voice is not being heard here is a really important question to ask. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to get involved in campaigns, and actually never have, only from just like a money donating standpoint, just kind of throw it over the fence and hope for the best. But I'm looking to actually get involved in campaigns in this cycle, and you know, when I don't know what a person does when they go and knock on a door. I just imagine it being really transactional, door to door, kind of salesperson thing. But if it was like something like this, like what we're talking about, actually talking with people and building those relationships, that sounds like an amazing activity, but regardless of the outcome, just sounds worth my time and something that I would want to do. So
I mean, that's the other piece, is that it is really rewarding. I mean, when you create this space, when you do this intentional relationship building, you build a relationship, and because it is authentic, it really feels, you know, it feeds you too. I want to be, we're a little past 3 o'clock, and I know we started a little late, but I do want to be respectful of people's time. So I'm going to take one more. Is there anybody else who's like, just like dying to say something?
I'll go two.
Two, okay.
Is it okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
So real quick, I just like what like the four of you said, especially you two.
like empirical evidence on the work we're doing. Like, we've had this chronic issue of getting people to give us feedback, of volunteering and getting involved, of having faith in the organization. And when we started doing this like 6-7 months ago, people, like, we had this open forum, for example, and all of a sudden everyone was speaking up, and they actually wanted to have another forum. And people were volunteering to facilitate it. And I mean, it was just a stark difference. It's like just factual. When you like really go out of your way to tell someone, I really want to know what is the issue, they speak up, and then they're angry. Maybe they're angry, but now they want to work with you. They don't want to just like yell at you. They actually want to say why it is they're mad, and then they want to help. Like, all of them were like, yeah, I'll volunteer to help make this forum happen, or, you know, it's just.
You know, people, I mean, again, this is something I found, you know, people want to contribute. You know, there's all this about what people want out of things, but people also want to contribute to things, and creating that space for people to contribute their story or other, it's just like so powerful. Last comment.
Yeah, so this is kind of talking about, I guess, a mixture of what Pablo was saying about like asking people like, all right, what's going on, and hearing their feedback, and then kind of like healing after that. And this goes back to the campaigns. Is I think for everybody in this room, we were all involved in some regard in the primaries. Most people, at least. Jimmy didn't do anything. Yeah. But now, like that was last week, the week before, and now we're kind of trying to heal after that. We're trying to kind of come back together as a party and remind ourselves why we're here and why the work that we're doing is so important. And I think this type of dialogue will be really helpful for that. I was wondering if there's anything else that people had thoughts on relating just to healing after like some really contentious primaries this year, because that's like a here now issue that we're still working on.
So off the top of my head, and this is not like really an answer, but I'll just kind of reflect. You know, we at Civity sometimes think of the work that we do, these kinds of conversations, as creating like a thread. My mother was a big knitter, and you know, she always had different plies of yarn. This is maybe some of you who are knitters. The ply sheets has to do with the number of threads that are in like a yarn. And okay, a little obscure reference there, but if you think about the conversations and the relationships that you can create intentionally this way as like just a little ply that's like, I see you as a fellow human being, that adds, you know, it doesn't replace maybe some of the negative relationships, you know, that are caused by power differences and status differences in our society, but it's like this one thread that says, I see you. I think that when you're talking about healing, you're talking about a situation where threads have been broken, and to kind of start recreating threads and reweaving that is, you know, it takes time, but it's a process. Yeah. Thank you. I want to thank you all for really showing up and being present today. I mean, not just physically present, but like really present in terms of talking to each other and thinking, and I really hope that you will take what we've talked about and process it and take it and do it. And I really want to thank Kayla for those of you who have worked with Kayla, she is like a pleasure to work with as an organizer, so thank you very much. I have two handouts. One is actually, it's a one-on-one conversation guide, which we've developed that is useful for people who want to do a conversation, like a 1 hour one-on-one conversation, like a Civity conversation. So if you want one of these, take it and pass it around. That's optional. The other is, I have a feedback form that we are always trying to, you know, make things work. So if you could take a few minutes and fill it out and put it here when you're done, that would be great. So I appreciate you taking 2 hours of a beautiful afternoon to spend inside. Thanks very much.
One of the things that I learned from Civity that laid the foundation for a lot of our building bridges is I think in our country the divide is pretty large between urban and rural, red, blue, north, south, if you say. And what Civity has done is it's allowed us to have meaningful conversations with people that are different from us in a way that respects them, allows for deep listening, appreciate where they may be coming from, and really trying to find some of the common ground. And I think this has really allowed us not to just have a conversation, but to actually go beyond and build some very deep, meaningful relationships. And I am grateful for what Civity created. It's created a foundation for engagement, and I believe it's an ethos that's valuable.
Important as a human being to have this type of training and have this knowledge that you're able to use. Number one, I think it's important for the Democrats because we can use it to have better interactions with voters. We can use it to build better community relationships and partner relationships. And then just as a human being, it's really important because you can talk to your family members that you might disagree with or other people that you might disagree with without it ending in an argument.
And I think there is this element of being uncomfortable that we're all really afraid of. There's like these niceties that we kind of dance around, and Civity has helped teach me how to really put the issues on the table and talk about them, meet the person where they're at, allow them to be heard. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that other people take it as well.
I think the most important skill is just being able to, and being open to talking to people with different viewpoints than your own. And I think it can be really hard, it can be really scary to talk to people that you disagree with, especially about issues that are really hard to talk about. And they could be family members that you don't want to talk about it because you don't want to have a bad interaction or start an argument and have this rift in your family. But I think sometimes, especially nowadays, we're so polarized right now that I think it's really important that we have to be having these conversations even if they're hard. So I really hope that more of that happens.